Hi, my name is Elizabeth Soto Albrecht. I live in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I've been living here around 3 decades. I raise our girls here. I'm here with my wonderful husband, Frank Albrecht. I write as a Puerto Rican Latina that have had many decades living in this country and now find myself going back to Puerto Rico and serving there occasionally.
My name is Dave Elkins, and I am the pastor of Central Mennonite Church in rural Archbold in Northwest Ohio. And I've been a pastor here for about 7 years.
Okay. Today's lesson is lesson number 10. Violence is not God's first choice. And we are working the First Chronicles chapter 22, verse 6 to 19. This is a kind of a controversial and dilemma text that breaks my heart because I grew up loving David. The David of Psalm 23, and although in the scripture you have his falling, his committing sin with a woman that's not his, I still beloved him as that ideal image, right? The ideal king, right? The way scripture, one of the historical scriptures wants to, particularly the Chronicles, because these are the writings of the kingdom, they have control of them, and they write that narrative. And then this wrestling with what are the consequences of our actions and why God communicated directly with this king to whom God favored, right? And said, no, you cannot build. So the whole aspect, and within this, as an Anabaptist writer, a minister, an activist on peace and justice, I see the justification of the beginning of the peace of God. It's been already in the Pentateuch and the Torah, and then you see it most more here. So it's not that it was started just in the Gospels. You have the primary elements of a God that his first choice is not violence, but is life-giving. What do you think about that, David?
Yeah, I appreciate that that perspective that you have of that, and it reminds me of that issue that we have in the church when people who are in leadership have significant failings. What do we do with the body of work that they have done, and how can we use that, and is it okay to still use that within the church? Because as we all know, God uses flawed vessels to carry out God's will. I mean, there's no other choice, right?
Right.
Everything that we do is a little bit stained by our brokenness and our fallenness.
Yeah.
And so, so the question is, like for David, who obviously had significant moral failings and failures, what is God saying here about this particular work of building the temple that makes David somehow unqualified to oversee the construction of this temple?
Yes. So it is definitely an ethical dilemma. What do we do? And it touches home in many ways. As Mennonites, as believers, we continue to hear this big leader of a mega church, this person that we loved and followed in their books and whatever, and touched us and gave us thought to keep on elaborating, disappoints us, and breaks the rule. What I've seen, and then yes, I've been a long time working with a seminary, a Protestant seminary, and I'm grateful that they teach us that we're all sinners here. And as broken, we come to the Lord's table. As broken, we come in to receive God's forgiveness and grace. But in this occasion, there's a higher stake when we are leaders, particularly. And this is something that I try to interpret for my Latino leaders. Yes, God will use you through his mercy, his love, in your skill sets, in your love for the community. But does that mean it's totally okay? Is it okay just because you ask for forgiveness? And the aspect of the higher, what's in higher stake here, David is the king. He has absolute power. And he breaks, trespass those lines that even him should not trespass. And there has to be consequences. So I look at it, what are the consequences? If something is between me and God, so there is a consequences. But if it's between me and the leadership that I'm called to, there's a higher consequence. And are we willing to live the consequences? And I think David, even calling back to the leadership and say, God told me this. He accepts it, that his hands are full of blood, that he built a whole kingdom. He was well known and loved, and now he cannot do this last thing, which is rebuild the temple. Built the temple for the Israelites' identity to be completed. It's really hard to receive a no when I am in power and no, I feel untouchable, but no one is untouchable, even David was. And I like his response. He didn't go beyond. He said, you know what, it's okay. At least my son, Solomon, will be able to continue the legacy. And that was the promise in this conversation. But there are definitely consequences. And what when the community wants to protect the individual? That's when it gets a little more messy and harder.
Yeah. And my thought goes to, was David able to pull himself back from being really super involved in the work that Solomon was charged to do, his son, right? When we, as parents, need to pass on a certain blessing or a work or responsibility to our children, are we super involved in what they're doing, and that we have to maintain control, maintain power over that situation? Are we able to really delegate, well, not only with our children, but also in, maybe our work settings or school settings, whatever it happens to be? Because as you read later on in the text and early in the text, you see just how much David accumulated and regarding the construction materials, in the finances. He arranged all the laborers to carry this out. And as I'm reading this, I'm thinking, well, what is there left for Solomon really to do? Because David seemed to have had it all figured out, right? And so you still see that kind of difficulty that those who are in power, those who have a certain amount of authority, it is hard to give that up. I think it is hard to really fully and truly delegate that to the next generation.
Definitely. And so there are some boundaries. Still, I accumulated, I designed, I had the spot, I had it all, but I wasn't able to complete the big dream, to see it completed. And he could have seen that it completed, but he respected that boundary. He said up to here, but yet I have the power at least to design it the way it should be. Anyway, those boundaries sometimes and I always say somehow, as I get older, is it that a good leader knows when it's time to let go and to say, hasta aquí, up to here? and I am not. I'm thinking about Moses. He was not able to go to the promised land. He saw it. Oh, how painful would it be? 40 years in this struggle, in esta lucha, and then he saw it, but he wasn't able to go. So we
Yeah,
have
he
examples.
and his experience was because of a sin, right? Because you know, he struck the rock twice at Kadesh in Numbers chapter 20, and because of that failure, wasn't necessarily maybe a moral failure, but it was a failure of faith in God. You know, the consequences were such that, you know, and so there's some parallels I think that can be made of this
Yeah.
story and the story of Moses and Joshua and the Promised Land.
Yes. Well, in the case, the aspect of this wonderful leader that we see of the 10 Commandments, he too, during 40 years, a very simple way I can interpret, he got contaminated with the attitude, the disbelief, something in that journey got him into that mindset, the tapping twice when he was told to do it once as a sign of his faith. Something so simple, right? As we see it very flat, well, it was just once, but it wasn't just once for God. It was demonstration of the same attitude that had been contaminated. Anyway, as we look back to this lesson number 10, as we go further into, I talk about good and bad leaders. And then how these two images, David and Solomon, are seen as very good leadership, and it'll always be the descendant of David. Even during Jesus' time, it was those descendant of David. David's name was continued. Solomon was the wise one, but somehow did not achieve the fame and the unforgettable image of that warrior king. Again, it is important for me as I read scripture as an Anabaptist, it's important to say that I say, okay, for God, it was very important that the person who is going to build the religious identity of the people in this post-exilic period when the chronicles are being written have clean hands and a clean heart, at least leading that. What does it mean for us? And David was an excellent king warrior, and his time had finished. And then there's a time for another set of skills to come in and to build this moment. I love the aspect of how David includes God and calls him Adonai Elohim, the aspect of God, the sovereign one, the Almighty. So right there's a, hey, I may have all the power here on earth, but you are the Almighty. And Elohim, the creator God. God that doesn't never cease to create, that will continue to create. So he gives that power to Adonai Elohim, to the aspect that God is ultimately in power. That concludes our time on this wonderful lesson. Thank you.